In today's global economy, quality matters. Benjamin Franklin once quipped, "The bitterness of poor quality remains long after the sweetness of low price is forgotten." Quality Matters is here to talk about all things quality. So whether you're looking to improve your business, getting ready for an audit, or dealing with failed inspections, tune in, check us out, then get back to doing work that matters.
Okay. Hey everyone, I'm Darcy.
I'm Kyle.
Welcome to Quality Matters, where we believe quality impacts us everywhere from the oil fields to our education system. You need the edge of quality in your organization. Kyle's giving me signals over here. Are you telling me to slow down or to be quiet? Listen as we discuss Quality Matters. Today we have a special episode for you. We have a guest. We have Mo Aziz here. Welcome, Mo.
Hello.
He's an attorney with the firm, this is a big long name, Abraham, Watkins, Nichols, Sorrells, Augusto, and Aziz. All right, so I came across Mo because, as many of you probably know, here in Houston, we recently had a pretty major plant fire in Deer Park at the Intercontinental Terminal Company. It went on for 3 or 4 days, I think. And Kyle and I had talked about discussing this on our podcast on one of our episodes, and I was reading a bunch of articles, and I came across a quote from Mo, and it said something to the effect of, "These things don't happen from one misstep, it's multiple missteps." And that's something that Kyle totally agrees with.
Absolutely.
He believes in putting the policies in place and keeping them going, following them, not just
Absolutely.
putting them in the place to say we got them, check. So I asked your staff to send over a bio so our listeners can know a little bit about you. Can I read some of this?
Sure.
It's pretty amazing.
It is. It's impressive.
In 2018, he was named on the top 100 super lawyers list for the 3rd year, on the Texas super lawyers list for the 6th year, and was honored by the South Asian Bar Association of Houston with this Distinguished Member Award. That's awesome. Congratulations. And some of the cases he served on that are related to the Deer Park fire. He was on the plaintiff's executive steering committee for the West Fertilizer Plant Explosion from 2014 to 2017, so
That's
that lasted
correct.
3
Yes,
years. He's currently involved in I say it wrong every time. Arkema litigation, representing first responders who weren't told about hazards from chemicals in a fire that broke out after Hurricane Harvey. And you're also currently representing plaintiffs injured on May 19th, 2018 at the I'm going to say it wrong again.
I think it's Curere
eval plant. Not you, the plaintiffs, I guess, are accusing the company of gross negligence, failure to read safety policies, and neglecting to create safety guidelines. Okay, so that's right up Kyle's alley. I'm going to kind of let you guys discuss this. I feel like my hands are washed and I'm out of there.
Sounds good.
But that's, like I said, that's Kyle's big philosophy. He helps companies put these policies in place, but then they kind of just put them in place and put them off to the side and don't necessarily follow them.
Yeah, so I talk a lot in the consulting work I do with folks about some of these preventative measures, these really, honestly, oftentimes very basic practices that they have to put into place. And, I've kind of got my own theories about how the management philosophy and, the philosophy around following up on nonconformities. We saw something very interesting yesterday about with the TCEQ, that they only... what was it?
Oh, yeah, I have it. Of course, you're going to...
The top 2% of the emissions that they actually fine on. So that means 98% of the nonconformities go almost without consequence. So it sounds like this is a lot of where you deal with. And so, we're all about putting processes into place to ensure that your team can work effectively, provide not only for the internal interested parties, but the external interested parties. And I just kind of love to hear a little bit of your experience and your thoughts on this to start with.
Sure, Kyle. Thanks for having me on. Having done these cases for a number of years, I think the consistent theme that I've seen whenever there's a fire, explosion, any type of disaster, is that either there's inadequate policies in place or inadequate technology in place, or it's in place but it's not being followed.
Correct.
Okay, so I'll give you an example. The incident that we had in May of last year at the eval facility in Pasadena. The series of missteps. The biggest one, actually all of them are pretty huge mistakes, but they were consultants like yourself who had given them recommendations.
Right.
That were not followed. And had they been followed as to systems and processes and technology, that had they been followed, we would not have had the incident. Okay. Also, just a basic policy as not having non-essential personnel on site during a startup. As you know, startup operations are one of the most dangerous times at a plant, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, if something's
Okay, so I'm going to pause because my job here on the podcast is to make sure everybody understands what y'all are talking about.
Sure.
So whenever I don't understand, I have to ask questions. So what is the startup at a facility?
Sure. No, good question. So, every 4 or 5 years, these refineries and these plants, chemical plants, were built, say, in 1970, right? The original plant was manufactured. Every 5 years, typically, depending on the age of the plant, what the management decides is, hey, we are going to do a complete overhaul of the maintenance, change out, gaskets, flanges, whatever that needs to be done, and bring in new equipment also and install it, which could not be installed when the plant is running, right?
So are these the turnarounds? So is that what we call turnarounds? Is that what I
Yes,
hear are turnarounds?
absolutely.
So when they start the plant back up after
That's
the
called a
turnaround.
startup.
Okay.
Right? So you have a turnaround, and after that, you're reintroducing chemicals into the plant. In case of the Carrera plant, it was ethylene. So you're restarting up the plant, and so that's the highest risk time.
Okay.
Because once the plant is running, fellas, once it's running, things kind of go. For the most part, they follow a pattern. With the startup, you've got elevated risk for incidents, and that's just documented in the industry.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody
Okay.
who's familiar with the industry has to agree that the startup is an elevated risk time, and traditionally, if there is elevated risk, non-essential personnel, what we call typically are contractors or operators, who are not needed to be essentially there to be involved in the turnaround or the startup, are told to not come to work that day, right?
Okay.
So you just say, hey, we're going to start up the plant.
Trying to minimize risk.
Minimize risk, right? I mean, you can have a fire, you can have an explosion, but if nobody's there in the path of it, well, at least you won't have loss of life or injury to humans.
Right.
You might have some property damage, right?
Right.
So that's a very basic safety feature. Don't you agree, Kyle?
Absolutely.
Right. So you're having a startup, keep non-essential people off. That wasn't followed in this particular situation.
Okay.
And then also, there's a lot of technology these days as to alarm systems, as to pressure monitors, temperature monitors within reactors that alerts operators as to, hey, there's that abnormal condition, right? And so another thing that we have discovered in that particular instance is operator error.
Yes.
And on them not recognizing the existence of certain abnormal conditions, not recognizing that these alarms are going off, and something must be off.
So maybe some lack of training in place for these
Right.
again, very basic systems that are in place.
Correct.
Is that your finding, that it's the lack of training that or are they just ignoring what they've been taught?
I think it's a combination, but it has to be lack of training, because if you have a high pressure alarm going off, that should put an operator on alert, right? And the
Right.
training should kick in at that point. If there's a high pressure alarm, which is the second degree or second level of alarm, you should just sound the general alarm, get people out of there, shut down, open
Right.
up the flare. And dump the reactor, right?
Yep.
So a lot of that was not followed. Okay.
Okay.
And there are technologies in place that kind of take the human element out of it. That as far as recognizing abnormal conditions. And so and those are not new technologies. They've been out there for decades.
Right.
Anyway, that's kind of part of what we found in that situation, right? As to what happened, at ITC, obviously time will tell in detail what happened.
Well, and luckily, from what I understand, there's been no injuries in regards to the fire. I know that afterwards there's been a lot of chemicals in the air. Lots of school districts have shut down, and I guess, like you said, time will tell if anything comes of that. I don't know.
Why is it that these companies chose to neglect these safety features?
Very easy answer: cost. I mean, it's all. That's what
I would assume.
That's what it comes down to, right?
Yeah.
So you've got a safety feature which is going to cost time and to install, and it's going to cost some money. And always that's what it comes down to. I mean, if somebody's got an alarm system which is outdated, it's going to cost money to fix that. If they've got a reactor system that needs updated or needs an updated set of interlock mechanisms, it really always comes down to cost.
Do you think they do? I'm sure they do, like a cost analysis to say, okay, if we fix this, it's going to cost us this much, versus if it explodes or there's a fire, it's going to cost us this much in, litigation. I mean, do they weigh their costs like that?
I wish they would, because that would really make it clear to them that when an incident does happen, it can cost hundreds of times more than would, if not even thousands of times more than what it would have done to create the fix, right?
Yeah.
So a safety interlock system that would maybe cost $500,000, if it can avoid a fire and explosion where dozens of people are injured and burned, that cost benefit analysis is just it doesn't even match up.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
These companies that are really struggling is they don't do the analysis. There's tons of tools out there for risk analysis, and they just simply don't use any of the risk analysis tools available.
They just look at the dollar signs for
Yeah,
right now.
that's
Say
it.
we can't afford that.
Because if they would do it, then they would see, hey, and maybe they do it and then they choose to ignore it, that wishing that it would never happen, or expecting, thinking that, hey, something like this is not going to happen. But if your system is broken, something is going to happen. That's just the nature of this industry. It's a dangerous business, because you're dealing with volatile chemicals, flammable materials, materials that if you inhale, people can die.
Right.
Materials that if they find an ignition source are immediately going to combust. So when you're playing in that environment, it's just a matter of time.
It is.
Well, and you were saying earlier that in Europe, they're not even allowed to have neighborhoods around these plants.
Sure.
Is that...
Yeah, so let me tell you a little bit about the West case, which the West Fertilizer Explosion, extremely unfortunate incident. First responders dead, seriously injured, citizens dead, injured. Thousands of homes damaged. But we found, and that case was again kind of focused on the manufacturers of ammonium nitrate, because a manufacturer of a product is the one who is in the best shoes to know of the dangers of that product, right?
Okay.
And so West Fertilizer itself was, Kyle, I think you said you'd been there.
Yeah, I grew up around there. I probably have visited that particular plant at least 10 times growing up.
Right.
And they had a feed store there. They had veterinarians nearby. It was kind of like the like Redneck Central.
Right.
I mean, it really was.
Sure. And it was like a mom and pop type of
It was.
Facility, right?
So were they manufacturing or they were selling?
They were just selling.
Okay.
Yeah.
And they had no idea of what the dangers were of that product.
Okay. Got it.
And let me give you an example. So Ted Upmore was the gentleman who had run that facility for 30 or 45 years.
Yeah.
For most of his life. I don't know.
Yeah,
if
it had been there
met
forever.
Ted.
It was a staple of the region.
Right. And so when the fire started, Ted was nearby. I think he said he was grilling burgers with his friends.
No, they did. They had a burger stand there,
Right.
and it was good.
and drinking.
So
he
funny.
was having a beer and drinking.
It's not funny. It's
No, but
not.
it's-
What happened is
yeah,
not
and
funny.
And that's something what they did every week, right? So anyway, so he was proceeding towards the plant. He saw the fire, and so he flips out his cell phone and had the phone number of one of the sales reps of the manufacturer programmed in there because he had such regular contact with him. And so he calls him, it goes to his voicemail. Now there's a fire burning over there. And a police officer had stopped him. He said, hey, okay, Dad, you need to stop. I forget his exact words, but it was something to the effect that, hey, there's a really big fire at the plant. I know this stuff is not explosive, but it's a really big fire. And then the line went dead. And that was the explosion.
Oh, wow.
Right?
Wow.
So I think it was 7:15 or something was the time, or whatever the exact time was, I forget now. But that was his knowledge of what he perceived the dangers of ammonium nitrate to be.
So again, training.
Yeah.
I mean, and you
Yeah.
would think as the owner of a store, you wouldn't necessarily need training, but you need education.
You
need
do.
at the
You
very
do.
least.
And if you're selling a product that's potentially hazardous, I mean, you should at least have a process to inform, to communicate
Sure.
to these external interested parties, as we talk about with the quality world. These are external interested parties, and they have every right to know what's going on with the product they're purchasing from you.
Right, absolutely. So that's, so they use the term stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right? So what we found in that case was they had the term stakeholders, that, hey, what information is being given to the stakeholders, which are not only the West Fertilizers of the world, but the communities that they're in.
Yeah.
Right? And so what we found in the course of discovery is that, CF Industries, for example, one of the largest manufacturers in the world, will not sell product to a West Fertilizer of the world in Europe under those circumstances. And those circumstances being if they're surrounded by homes, if they're in a residential area. Here we had West was next to an apartment complex,
Oh my gosh.
a nursing home,
Oh wow.
and a high school.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
No,
so-
literally, the high school is behind. I mean, you could hear them playing football while you're picking up the feed.
It's
Right.
right there in the middle of
And-
everything.
Yeah.
And I mean, God forbid if this had happened during daytime
Oh my gosh.
with the kids there, I mean, this would have been 10 times worse.
Yeah.
Right. So, my question to them, to the CEO of what CF in his deposition was, hey, why do you do this differently over here? Like, if you won't do it in Europe,
Good question.
why do you do it here?
Right.
And there really is no good response to that. I mean, I guess the company's overall response was, well, we're not required to do it, right?
Yeah.
So,
I mean, it comes
before.
back to cost. It's back to cost.
Right.
It's all about the profit.
I'm sure you've heard that before, Kyle.
I
When somebody
have.
said, hey, well, that's a good idea, but does the law require us to do it?
And I hate that answer. I absolutely hate that answer. I haven't gotten it many times, but the few times I have, it just makes me cringe and sick to my stomach. If what's within the bounds of the law is your only guide to what's right and wrong, I mean, you are literally pushing the line of immorality in every way and doing your best not to legally cross it. I mean, you have to work to care about people. You have, whether it's the folks that you're paying for, whether it's the folks that like this are coming and purchasing your product. Working within the bounds of the law, it makes me cringe every time I hear that, because it tells you the mindset of the person.
Right. And so, and one thing that we also learned was what they did was the basic minimum. Hey, we're going to give them a safety data sheet or MSDS sheet, right? That's what the law requires us to do. So you're selling somebody a highly hazardous product, which is being stored in unsafe conditions. And I'll tell you in a second about their knowledge of storage. And all you have to do is give them a piece of paper that says, hey, this can explode under certain, which has a bunch of scientific stuff on there. Right.
See, I was
As you imagine at Redneck Central,
yes.
they're probably not going to read that.
And even if they do, they don't have a clue what any of it means. I was a safety manager for nearly 10 years, and I don't know what half that stuff means sometimes. I mean, it's better now with the GHS system, and they've got better pictograms, but even then, you have to look at it and say, do they really mean it?
Right.
And I mean, you really have to. I mean, the average person is not in a position to make those determinations.
They're not, and it's in fact there's, there was emails in there where they were talking about, hey, your average farmer type needs a little better explanation. Because the MSDS is a technical document. It's not supposed to be for a user.
No.
and to warn them of the dangers. So, but again, the response was, hey, that's all we're supposed to do is get MSDS.
Well, I cringe now thinking about as a kid, because I used to go with my pawpaw, and I don't remember how many tons, but it was several tons of ammonium nitrate that he would get at a time. And he had this special truck that he could rent that would just haul just enormous sums, the size of a dump truck. And then he would drive it out across the pastures, and it had a sprayer on the back. And I'm just thinking about, wow, we're just driving around with...
So what is ammonium nitrate used for? I don't even
Sure,
know.
that's great. That's a really good question. So ammonium nitrate is a chemical that was developed during World War I by the Germans to be used as an explosive.
Okay.
And
So the farmers were using it for...
and it's what it does is, it's got certain qualities that will have basically fertilize the soil and have a better crop.
Okay.
Your crop production per acre goes up.
Okay.
Right? Because as it decomposes, it just has this side benefit of that.
Well, and as the animals eat, especially like in pastures, the animals eat the hay. Nitrates are a number one component in the production of amino acids and proteins. So as you have cattle grazing on the grass, they are eating all of the nitrates. And so
Correct.
then your pasture is just barren after a while if you don't replenish it.
Right.
Okay, I see.
But there's numerous other types of fertilizer which are not explosive, not as hazardous, There's numerous other types of fertilizer that can be used and now is being used. There's and in fact is manufactured by the same companies. They have
Really?
different lines. And so, and ammonium nitrate is just one which has been, over time, it has gotten a bad rap, if you will, and understandably so, because same type of material that was used by Timothy McVeigh
Right.
Oh, okay.
to blow up Oklahoma,
Right.
the Murrah building,
Yeah.
right? And after that, it was also used in the first World Trade Center attack. So then they've been restricting. The government has been restricting access to it. You can't just nowadays. Carl, maybe what you're talking about, maybe 20 years ago when you...
Yeah, it changed after 9/11 because I remember Pawpaw got mad because he rented the same truck and went to pick up the fertilizer. They wouldn't let him get nearly as much.
Right, they wouldn't, because they have some regulations, but on the security part of it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But basically, it's a outdated fertilizer which
Gotcha.
over the years has been used and is still used actually overseas by terrorists to make IEDs and that sort of thing. So it's a bad chemical.
Yeah.
And really shouldn't be stored in the middle of all towns in
Right.
Texas. You go to
Yeah.
any small town, you see the feed store, and they're going to have the grain silos, and then they'll have the AN storage facility.
Yep.
That's so scary. People just don't realize what's around you and
No, not at all.
like all the plants that are around us. But you said, what was it? Oh, I'm curious. Who was found liable in that? Was it West Texas or West?
Fertilizer.
Yeah, or was it the manufacturers?
So that case never went to trial. There was a
okay.
there were out of court
Okay.
settlements
Okay.
with the manufacturers.
Okay.
And the case was resolved.
Okay.
The terms are confidential, but it was a favorable resolution. And I think as a result of our digging up all this information about the dangers of ammonium nitrate, there's some changes made by OSHA as how it can be stored now. I mean, I still
Okay.
don't think they're ideal, but now they require you to cover the wooden storage with some type of material that would be fire resistant up to an hour.
Right.
Okay.
So at least there's some changes.
A little bit of change.
Some positive has come out of that.
So how does all of this work, before we close up here, with what little bit of information is out for ITC? What are some of the safeguards that were missed? Do we know anything about that yet? Have you heard anything that you're able to talk on?
Sure. So again, like you said, it's early, Carl, but one question that is in my mind is, hey, you have a fire that starts on your facility. Okay, where is your first response team? Because as you know, every refinery has their own in-house response team.
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay? And operators volunteer to do it. They say, hey, I'm going to do this. I'm going to be on the first response team, right?
And there's a series of trainings you're supposed to get with it, but yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that you have to have dedicated folks that are ready to respond.
Right, and so you have, and some of them, and I don't know again what their setup was, but they actually have their own fire trucks sometimes, and they have at least
wow.
maybe one that they'll rush out there and just to nip it in the bud. So we don't have a situation where by the time you've got, LaPorte or Pasadena, whichever the responding units
Right.
are, they're supposed to try to just mitigate the fire right at the get-go.
Right.
Okay, and I don't think that happened here. And I think as time progresses, there'll be what will come to light is that there was some confusion as to where the fire is, how and who's responding to it, and there'll be some evidence that the fire response, the initial response was not by the plant itself, was not timely.
Gotcha.
So I think that's one of the things that we're hearing. Again, it's going to take a lot of time and effort to figure out how this happened and what the environmental impacts of this event are going to be on that area and the residents.
Well, I know Kyle himself, he has asthma and allergies, and when it was after they put it out. It was the day they put it out. You were out of town, and as he was driving back in, he could feel his asthma flaring.
Apparently,
up.
the plume descended on 290 as I was driving in from Central Texas, and I could smell the smoke, and my lungs started closing up, and so it's been a fun couple of days
a lot
since
of
then.
people that are a lot closer.
I'm sure. I
felt
can't
the
imagine.
effects.
Especially infants and elderly people or people who have pre-existing respiratory issues.
Yeah.
They're at.
Well, and I don't know how this will affect them, but there was an article in the Chronicle about all the different times that ITC in particular has been fined for many different things.
Yeah.
And that's where we found that only about 2% of emissions over permitted levels result in a penalty from the state. So it's like how many people are getting away from it. With
So
it.
I guess before we close up here, I don't want to take up too much time. I really appreciate you being on here with us. If you had any kind of advice for our listeners, or probably oftentimes quality managers, supervisors, maybe small business owners, what's your advice to these folks to avoid these potentially hazardous situations?
Well, my advice, Carl, would be that they need to listen to the professionals, the safety professionals, and the recommendations that they're making, and follow them to the T, because that's the way to avoid these disasters. Right, is to learn from them, learn from history, and then implement change moving forward.
Yeah.
I like it.
And do the cost-risk analysis of,
Yeah,
what's going to happen if we
exactly.
don't.
Yeah, you need to know, and like I say, follow to the T, because I've seen this where folks, they get the recommendations and then they make their expert opinion on top of the expert's opinion of what really does and does not need to be followed. And, my favorite, and I'm sure you've heard this plenty of times, is we've always done it this way.
Yeah, I've read many emails where they've said, okay, but we've been doing it this way for 30 years, everything's just fine. Well, then it's not.
Until it's not.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thanks for coming on
Thank
with
you.
us. We appreciate
Thank you.
your time.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much.
This is kind of a follow-up to the interview that we did with Mo Aziz. We had our interview, and then on the way home, Kyle and I were talking, and a couple of questions came up as we were driving home. Actually, I only remember one in particular. And Kyle and Mo were talking about how these plants and refineries have their first responder team, which was something I didn't know. So I had heard, I believe it was the county commissioner. I've read several articles about this ITC plant fire, and I think it was the county commissioner that said he was frustrated because he had told ITC officials to get extra people in early. And so my question is, I wonder if it was because they only used their own first responders at the plant and didn't call in 911 soon enough, or if he just meant other 911 first responders from other cities and departments.
No, that sounds very reasonable to me. I guess the thing that's so shocking with this is they seem so incredibly ill prepared for something like this to occur.
But that is shocking. But what is more shocking is if you find that article that I mentioned when we did the interview with Mo, that the Houston Chronicle had about all their fines. There's so many fines in the past, and I mean, it's not, well, to us, it's not a small fine. To them, it probably is, but we're talking, thousands of dollars, tens of thousands of dollars, and repeated multiple incidents. I mean, I can't even remember. I read it to you. We talked about it. I don't remember how many.
Oh, it's no way. It was at least 10 different events, and this is going back, almost a couple of decades. But it's a couple of decades of problem after problem. And okay, let's be honest. I don't know as much about these facilities as I should, but I do imagine at a certain scale there will be problems, and you are supposed to report everything.
I feel like this is kind of going to be their tipping point because, as I mentioned, we recorded that interview on Friday. We came home. I was on social media scrolling through, and it's where I get my news these days. So I was scrolling through, and I found out that while we were doing the interview, they had a partial dike wall collapse at ITC. So I guess when they, the burn happened, and then some of the chemicals escaped, or I don't know what happened. So somehow some of the chemicals got out. So they had a dike wall that was containing some of those chemicals. It partially collapsed, leaking chemicals into the ship channel. Part of the ship channel had to be closed down. And then even after that, I'm not sure when that happened, maybe noon or 2.
Yeah.
Even after that, something else caught on fire.
Yeah.
At ITC.
Yeah.
And they had to, I think it seems it was a fairly quick situation, but they had to close down part of the beltway. And so it was going on. And right before we came to record this part, I just saw a quick headline of another article about how they several chemicals were released during Hurricane Harvey.
Right.
And, to be fair, somebody commented and said probably most of those refineries had several chemicals released because everybody was flooded.
The thing that, if I could take anything from all of this, how many times have you done, a lot of folks have probably done the emergency drills at their business, right?
I'm sure I know when I was teaching, we had to do fire drills once a month.
Exactly.
It was required.
How much of the time do people actually pay attention on those, and how often do you document the problems? I came from a not very large facility over in LaPorte. We had a shelter-in-place policy, and we would do a shelter-in-place drill every so often. Then we would do emergency drills. And I always had fun with the emergency drills because I would pick someone to hide or someone to not cooperate, or if someone was absent, I would tell people to have conflicting data about who was absent just to see if I could get folks tripped up. And we would do this in the drills. And we did this in drills for a facility that really had no major hazards that would merit an evacuation.
Right.
When you have hazards that merit an evacuation, it would seem wise to me to have pre-planned multiple procedures and to have an enormous amount of training for these folks.
Well, that's the thing. I think, and we've talked about this in the interview with Mo, there's lots of planning that takes place.
Yeah.
And maybe a review here and there, but the training that needs to occur does not occur. And there's, we've talked about how passionate you are in particular about these kinds of things. And it just seems that these guys that are on the job are just on the job, and they don't have a passion for what they do, which is sad.
No, I agree with that. And that might be a talk soon, because the safety culture in America, sometimes it's great and sometimes it's terrible, and you have to get people passionate about their own safety. Yeah. So that's another chat for another time.
So we wanted to just do this quick follow-up before we close up. I want to talk about a couple of reviews that we've gotten on our podcast. I guess they come through on iTunes. Kyle handles all that, and he looks it up and shows me. One in particular that I really liked said something like, it's like sitting down with a cup of coffee and my favorite married couple. So I really appreciated that, because we are a married couple, and I'm glad that you guys enjoy listening to us, that our friendly banter comes across. I'd also like to mention, y'all, that we are an orphan podcast, meaning we are looking for some adoptive parents, otherwise known as a sponsor. If you would like to consider sponsoring our Quality Matters podcast, contact one of us. You can find our numbers on our website at Texas Quality Assurance. You can find either one of us on LinkedIn, and we can start a discussion about it. We would also like your feedback. We have some giveaways, our coffee mugs that Kyle is very passionate and excited about.
Yes.
Our Coffee Matters coffee mugs. And we've been tossing around ideas about how to give those away to our listeners. So if you have an idea on how we could pick people at random or how we could decide who to give them to, we would appreciate your input. I think that's all.
I think that's it.
All right. Thanks for listening, guys.